Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker. Thank you for joining me today. For today's card, I'm going to be using this new stamp set from Mama Elephant, which is called Wish Upon a Star. There are a bunch of really adorable bunnies in this stamp set, and I could not choose which ones I wanted to color, so I decided to stamp all 4 of them, and I stamped those on Bristol Smooth paper, and I used Gina K Designs Jet Black Amalgam ink. I'm going to be coloring these in using my Arteza Real Brush pens, and I kept the coloring really simple for these. I actually only used 4 markers total. Sorry about that camera bump there, I accidentally hit it with my hand. So like I said, I stamped these onto Strathmore Bristol Smooth paper, which I find to be the most easy paper to use with these particular markers. It makes the blending process so much easier. If you're struggling with Arteza markers and you're not using Strathmore Bristol Smooth paper, you got to get some because it is by far the easiest paper to use them with, and it's a complete game changer. This first color that I'm using is the color Ginger, and I used it for the bodies on all of the bunnies, and I basically just added it to the areas where I wanted it to be darkest, and then I used my water brush to blend out that color. And like I've mentioned before in other videos, I don't actually use my water brush like it's meant to be used. I don't fill it with water because I just personally find it difficult to control a water brush. So instead, I have some water on my mat, which this is the Tim Holtz glass mat, and I just pick it up with the brush and use it like a regular paintbrush. Now, the reason that I'm using a water brush and not a regular paintbrush is simply because I really like this Tim Holtz Fine Detailer brush. I like how fine the point is on that brush, and I find it helps when I'm coloring small areas. This next color that I'm using is the color Apricot, or Apricot depending on where you're from. I'm using that to color in the ears, and I'm using the same kind of coloring technique where I color in the darkest area and then blend it out with the water brush. For all of the white areas in my coloring, I always like to add a little bit of shading. So for the shading on the white areas, I'm using the color Elephant Gray, and I'm just adding a very small touch of that so that it has a little bit more depth and isn't just flat white. I also used that gray color to color in my moon, and as I was coloring my moon, I tried to give it a little bit of texture. If you look at the real moon, it isn't a smooth surface. There's a lot of texture to it because of the craters. So in order to kind of create that texture, I first added my shading, and then when I blended it out, I kind of used a circular motion with my brush. It's a very subtle detail, and it's probably a little bit difficult to see in the video, but I think it really adds to it in real life. Now, the last color that I used is the color Chamomile, and I used that to color in the stars and the little bird. I used my scan and cut in order to cut out all of those images, and then I moved on to create this background. At this point, I still didn't know which of those bunny images I was going to use, but I did know that all of them would go really well with a night sky background, so I used my Distress Oxide inks to create that. Starting from the bottom of the panel and working my way up, I used the colors Tumbled Glass, Broken China, Salty Ocean, Blueprint Sketch, and Black Soot. And by the way, the paper that I'm using is a piece of Canson watercolor paper. Once the blending was done, I took out my cloud stencil from My Favorite Things and also some Hero Arts Unicorn White Pigment ink, and I'm going to blend that along the top of that stencil to create some clouds in my sky. I also blended some of that ink right along the bottom edge of this piece of Canson watercolor paper so that it could kind of look like the clouds keep on going and there's some clouds right underneath the ones that are at the bottom. I removed the background panel from the board and I cut it down to be 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and then I dried it with my heat tool and I went over it really well with my powder tool because I'm going to be doing some embossing. Now, whenever you emboss on top of Distress Oxide ink blending, you want to make sure that that ink is really dry, and I definitely recommend testing the paper before you start stamping. So the way that you test it is you just sprinkle some of your embossing powder onto the paper before you do your stamping, and if it comes off, then you're good and you can start embossing. But if it sticks, you can wipe it off, and you know that you have to let it dry for a little bit longer before you can move on to the stamping. So I stamped all over this background with a bunch of the different star images from the stamp set, and I stamped them with Versamark ink, and then I embossed them with a clear embossing powder. That embossing powder that I used is Icicle embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. Once I finished heat setting that first batch of stars, I decided I wanted to fill in some of those empty spaces between the stars with the smallest star from the stamp set, and so I stamped those and then I embossed them in the same clear embossing powder. Next, I took that panel and I put it into my Misti Tool, and I'm going to stamp my sentiment, which also comes from that same Mama Elephant stamp set, and I'm embossing this with a white embossing powder. This is Alabaster white embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. I pulled out my Hero Arts nested rectangle die set, and I used 2 of those dies in order to create a frame out of a piece of Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock. Using my ATG gun, I adhered my background panel onto an A2 size card base. And next, I took that frame that I created and I added some thin pieces of foam tape all along the back of it, and then I popped it up in the middle of the card. Now, I was extremely tempted to turn this frame into a shaker on my card because you know me, I love my shakers, but I resisted that temptation because I thought that the simplicity of just the popped up frame on the card really worked with my overall theme. I decided to use that little bunny on the cloud for this particular card. All of the other bunnies that I colored in can be used for other cards, and I used some foam tape to pop him up, and then I used my Wink of Stella glitter brush and I went over the cloud and the frame. And here's a closer look at the finished card. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you really enjoyed this card design featuring that new stamp set from Mama Elephant. All of the supplies that I used for today's card can be found in the description down below. If you're new to my channel and you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to hit that subscribe button. I do new card videos every single week, and I'm going to be back with another one really soon. Again, thank you for watching. I appreciate all of you, and I hope you have a good day today.